I said, I can tell you what it means to me and some of my people, but I can't tell you what God wants to say to you. They basically said, huh? I said, but I'll make a deal with you. If you'll tell me what it means to you, then I'll tell you what it means to me. And they did. Pretty soon somebody says, I think it means this. And somebody, no, it doesn't mean that, it means this. And they started arguing back and forth, forgot about me. Then they looked at me and said, what does it mean to you? But the question had changed from what does it mean to what does it mean to you? And in this kind of a context, these people got in the habit of listening to God instead of listening to me. What a concept. And they got right cheeky with the rest of the mission. And I got in big trouble. See? Because from the perspective of the rest of the mission, I was feeding them all of these, these ideas, rebellious ideas, kind of thing. From my perspective, they were learning to get me out of the way and listen directly to God. And I think that's what it's all about. And the church started growing, or kept growing actually. And we kept baptizing people. And the mission sent a commission over to check us out. And they sent 3 guys, all of whom were employed by the mission, to evaluate our Christian dances. And they decided that this really wasn't of Jesus, that we weren't supposed to have these dances. And so they condemned them. That didn't get them stopped, but that was the little ritual they went through. One of the guys, one of the 3 Nigerians that they sent, he said to me, I would have voted in favor of those dances. But he said, my hands are all like claws because of leprosy, and I can't hoe anymore. And what he meant was that if he had taken a position against the leaders of the mission, he would have lost his job and had to go back to farming. And I began to understand the kind of price that some of them were having to pay for coming up with new, quote-unquote, old ideas. And that is that any culture is right for God. And that God wants to enter the lives of everybody without requiring them to convert from one culture to another. We also had another problem, and that is that in our tribal group, the definition of a leader, a male leader, included a home with more than one wife in it. And this mission, like just about all missions in the late 50s and quite a few still to this day, they make the mistake of assuming that polygamy is adultery. Because our definition of marriage involves only one wife. But for these people, their definition of legal, legitimate marriage includes more than one wife. And the missionaries never took any time to try and understand where they were coming from. They never looked at the fact that this was Social Security for all of the women. All of these women got married. They didn't waste a single one. Women are so valuable in this society that they're provided with security of marriage. And this means, since there are more marriageable women, there's about 10 years extra marriageable women than marriageable men, because women get married around age 15 and men at about 25. And so you've got that group of extra women there. Since there are extra women, people get extra wives. Now this can be abused. Some people get to be collectors. like Solomon. This was a really bad thing that Solomon did, not because he married more than one wife, but because he stole other guys' wives. There were probably lots of young guys in his society that didn't have any wife at all because he was collecting. He hit 1,000, I guess, wives and concubines. Really, really a bad idea. But here were the leaders of the society. We couldn't have any leaders in our church, any people who were natural leaders, looked up to by their society. Because this requirement that they handle well a home with more than one wife in it, they couldn't meet. So we had to work with younger people. Anyway, I began to listen to these guys. Mind you, we were in a pioneer area. And I said to them one time, I said, how come every time we get into a discussion, if it goes more than 5 or 10 minutes, we always get to the subject of polygamy? Is this that important to you? They went on for a couple hours then telling me how they were totally compromised by this rule. And then they summed it up and said, but we have no voice. I said to myself, whatever it costs me, from now on they have a voice. Well, it cost me my job as a missionary. That's how you get to be a teacher. See, if you can do. If you can't do, teach. If you can't teach, teach teachers. Yeah. That's the way it goes, right? So I had to look for alternate employment after that. But the church kept growing, and it's still growing. And 14 years after we left the field, they changed the rule. Now, it came out in our church paper that the Nigerian church has decided to baptize people on the basis of faith alone. Isn't that great? They finally caught up with the scriptures. On the basis of faith alone. Now, one of the problems is we don't have to guess at what God's attitude is, because when polygamy happens in the scriptures, He doesn't say a word against it. Now, I don't think this means that He's in favor of polygamy, but what it means is He's patient with it. He was patient with it all the way through the Old Testament, and by New Testament times it was dead. There's hardly any polygamy at all, even though it was still allowed, hardly any polygamy at all in Jewish society in Jesus' day. But then people say, well, what about these one-wife passages in Timothy and Titus? Interesting thing about them is they were written to Greeks, and polygamy was never a part of Greek culture. So they must mean something other than polygamy. And indeed they do. They mean, in Greco-Roman culture, marriage was for eternity. If your wife died, the leaders at least weren't supposed to remarry. And so it refers to the custom called digamy. Now, I argued with the mission leaders, and they couldn't get me to retract. I told them, I said, if I can see in the Bible that your position is correct, I said, I'll give my life for it. But if I see a contrast between the Bible and your position, I'm going to fight you tooth and nail. Because someday I expect to stand before the throne of God and have some black man point to me and say, because you didn't follow your conscience, I'm doomed to hell. And I said, I'll lay that person's blood at your feet. They didn't like that real well. So they sacked me. Okay? And like I said, that's how you get to be a teacher. Well, what am I going to teach? Well, I did what anybody does when they get sacked. You go back to school. Why? Because that's the only thing we've ever learned to do. The basic thing we learn in school is how to go to school, right? So I went back to school. I was going to work on my PhD. and I got my PhD and was asked to join the faculty of a secular university to teach and write on and in the Hausa language. In those days, our government was trying to develop experts in various languages of the world, lest there be some kind of a military emergency or something like that. I don't know what they were dreaming about, a military emergency in northern Nigeria, but anyway, Hausa got to be one of the languages on the list. It is the largest, numerically largest language of Africa. Of the couple of thousand languages of Africa, Hausa is larger. It's larger than Swahili, numerically. So it is quite an important language in a rather restricted area. So anyway, Michigan State University hired me to be an African language expert, and to teach Hausa and deal with African languages in general. So I did that for 3 years, and then in the 4th year we were able to get a grant to go back to Nigeria. And one of my first contacts then with the new field director of our mission, he looked at me and said, can you help us teach the Nigerian church leaders to baptize polygamists? I said, what? He smiled and said, I know why you had to leave the field. He said, you were just a little ahead of your time. He said, but 6 years later, now we all agree with you. Very interesting. Well, we helped them, and we helped them learn the Hausa language, and got back on good terms with the mission, and in the process gathered language material on 65 languages that nobody's interested in. I published that later on in 3 volumes. And I don't know, we had to pay the publisher $10,000 to publish it. I don't know who's paying for its storage. It never got to be a bestseller. But somewhere there's just probably hundreds of these these green-covered books. Now, one of the questions that the Nigerians had asked when I was there was, what do we do about evil spirits? Well, before that they asked a question. They said, do you believe in evil spirits? I said, well, have you had experience with them? They said, oh yeah, they told me stories about getting chased home by evil spirits and things like that. I said, okay, I trust you, so I believe in them. That wasn't much, but they thought it was the best answer they'd gotten out of any of the missionaries. But then when they said, what do we do about them? I didn't know. I was supposed to be able to help them. I recognized what they told me. I said, what's your biggest problem? They said, evil spirits. And I didn't know how to help them. But that question stuck in my mind as we went home, and I went into being an African language expert. 3 years at Michigan State, 1 year in Nigeria, back to Michigan State for another year, and I get an invitation to come to the biggest and most prestigious African language program in the world in Los Angeles, University of California, Los Angeles. So I got to be right at the top of that field. So 1968, went out to Los Angeles after swearing that I would never live in that godforsaken part of the world. Warning against saying things like that. So we went tooting off to Los Angeles, and I taught for the next 5 years at UCLA. But while I was there, we renewed contact with a fellow who was teaching in the School of World Mission, and